Thanks for joining us. I'm Jay Mechi. I am digital organizer with Freedom to Thrive. And Freedom to Thrive's mission is to abolish the punishment based carceral systems through transformative organizing, strategic partnerships, and convening shared learning spaces. Our work centers around combating crimmigration, which is the intersection of criminal, legal, and immigration enforcement. And we do all this using a pro Black, gender affirming lens. And today we have some amazing guests with us. And we brought them together because, as many people know, education, which really centers the Black experience and recognizes Black struggle, is really under attack. We're seeing this like all over in Florida, in Alabama, and Texas. And, we invited these amazing scholars here to hear about their experiences and hear about their work, and also to just demonstrate that the Black community will not be silenced in our fight for liberation. So, with that in mind, first I'll introduce Lisa Bates, who's a professor at Portland State University in the Tulane School of Urban Studies and Planning and in Black Studies. Her research and practice includes deep engagements with community-based organizations working towards racial justice and housing rights, including Portland's Anti-Displacement Coalition. Dr. Bates' work is at the intersection of art, urban planning, and radical geographic thought, develops new visions of Black history, present, and possibility. And Layla D. Brown is an assistant professor of cultural anthropology and Africana studies and affiliate faculty in women's gender and sexuality studies. Layla's research focuses on Pan African socialist and feminist social movements in Venezuela, the US, and the broader African diaspora. And she's working on completing her first book manuscript entitled An Anthropology of Pan Africanism in the 21st Century, an ethnographic exploration of the rise of Pan-African/feminist activism and the social movements in Venezuela and the U.S. Layla is also the co-host of the new podcast, Life Study Revolution, with Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. So today, just a few of the things we're going to be talking about: racial capitalism. I'm always trying to talk about racial capitalism. It's so important, and it affects so many things. We also want to talk a little bit about just centering Black ways of knowing and challenging dominant colonial paradigms of knowledge production. And then we'll talk about Afrofuturism and maybe imagining what's possible. And then just at the end have like some announcements and close. So with that in mind, I just wanted to ask, how would either of you explain the concept of racial capitalism and how it manifests in the context of the US and also the broader African diaspora?
I can start. I think the most basic way to think about what racial capitalism is to just understand that racism and capitalism are mutually constitutive. So it just literally means that the way that capitalism as a global system would not develop without these sort of racial logics that have come along with it. And I think there are like a number of people who have done and are doing work. I think some of the sort of classic people that think about it are like Oliver Cromwell Cox and Cedric Robinson. There's actually a really good piece by my friend Charisse Burden-Stelly in Monthly Review. It's a 2020 piece on, I think it's modern U.S. racial capitalism. And Robin Kelly has a good lecture online about what is racial capitalism and why does it matter. But as I was thinking about how to answer this question, I just wanted to pull a brief quote, if I can read it for people. So it comes from Bernard Magubane's 1979 work. The political economy of race and class in South Africa. And in the introduction, I think really kind of lays things out, but I just wanted to read this one little passage. He says that racism is not an abstraction, nor is it its own justification. The racial structure of South African society arose from the severest exploitation and contempt guaranteed by power. Anyone who wants to change the structure of racial oppression must understand its fundamental nature, its historical formation, and its manipulation by the rulers. Racial oppression and class exploitation are inextricably intertwined in the modern world. They cannot be neatly separated for the sake of theoretical purity. He goes on to quote Kwame Nkrumah, describing the dialectic between race and class. And these are Kwame Nkrumah's words. Each historical situation has its own dynamics. The close links between class and race developed in Africa alongside capitalist exploitation. Slavery, the master servant relationship, and cheap labor were basic to it. The classic example in South Africa, where Africans experienced a double exploitation, both on the ground of color and of class. Similar conditions exist in the US, the Caribbean, in Latin America, and other parts of the world where the nature of the development of productive forces has resulted in a racist class structure. In these areas, even shades of color count, the degree of blackness being a yardstick by which social status is measured. So I think that, and even in the lecture that Robin Kelly offers, he tries to explain that as much as we think about race as this kind of semi biological category that we now understand to be a sort of social construction, that even these racial logics are not necessarily based on the kind of phenotypic depictions of what we understand blackness to be, because he makes the argument that these racial logics existed even as Western conquering Europeans were dealing with Irish folks, the Romani, a number of folks who predate the sort of anti-black racism that we see today. And so that's the contribution I'll make about that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Definitely going to have to check out some of those resources you mentioned. That book in particular sounds pretty amazing. I don't know, Lisa, do you have a thought?
Well, I think, Robin Kelly, his recent work to sort of talk about this concept and talk about Cedric Robinson's concept is really important. Uh, I guess what I would just add, because this is an amazing explication that Dr. Brown shared, is there isn't a capitalism that's not racial capitalism, right? So when people say, "Oh, it's racial capitalism," what's the other kind? There isn't another kind. In the development of this system, economic, social, and political, there was no time that happened without the creation of racial category and racial hierarchy. So it's almost like it is the definition of what it is. And I think that I appreciate that you started off and your work is thinking about this, because I think the more that we can understand that these two things, race and class, are constituting each other constantly, the more we're able to sort of diagnose what's really going on and think about how social movements can activate.
That's so true. It just makes me think about, I've heard people say that, Black folks in the US were the original capital. And when we talk about the accumulation necessary for capitalism to even happen, that accumulation was based off of, the stolen labor of trafficked Africans. So, not being able to separate those things, I agree, is such an important point. Which brings me to this other question of, what are some specific examples of like policies or practices that illustrate the impact of racial capitalism on Black communities, in the context that both of you have studied?
Well, working in housing and urban planning and urban studies, it's all of it. The very creation of the concept of property, of land as property, and the way that land and property are valued, and it is entirely based on racial hierarchy from the beginnings of colonization, where the presence of whiteness made land into property and made it worth something, made it a commodity that you could trade in exchange for dollars. The creation of the savage indigenous person who's not using it right. They're not using it right. So white people get to have dominion over this space. And then, as you just mentioned, the creation then of human beings as property, the transformation from person to property to thing, and labor as part of that property. And that carries through today to everything that we understand now about when we talk about market value of housing, neighborhoods, is highly racialized. The presence of whiteness makes places and spaces valuable. The presence of blackness or brownness makes them unvaluable. And that there's kind of constant a trap there, right? So you talked about, we were the property. When we talk about the idea that we can get intergenerational wealth through owning a home in one generation, the reason it doesn't work for Black people is because the presence of Black people owning that home devalues it in the market, and actually, it's kind of a never-ending cycle. The moment at which Black people started to break through home buying in the early 2000s, what came next? Subprime and predatory lending, the Great Recession, the foreclosure crisis, and massive loss of that property. So there's always a trap in that racialized property moment. You can't we can't, I don't believe, go from being the intergenerational wealth that people were passing down to somehow getting intergenerational wealth by playing the game in the current system. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of in everything that I do and think about.
And that I would just echo that sentiment about the everything. That was when we both laughed at the same time. That was the thought, like that, because if you think about the fact that there is no escaping capitalist exploitation in the current world, not just the U.S., not just Western Europe. It doesn't matter. There is no escaping it, right? And so to ask where does it manifest? It literally manifests everywhere. Right. It might be a better question to ask where it does not manifest. But I think just in terms of just another example of what that kind of looks like, even in relationship to land too, right? So my work is in Venezuela. A lot of my earlier work was in Venezuela. And I don't know how much you know or the audience knows about the history of Venezuela, but prior to the current moment where the Bolivarian Revolution has existed, Venezuela was considered an ideal democracy, right? And it was largely considered an ideal democracy in the Latin American third world, developing world context, because as a country, it continued to allow itself to be exploited by the US, right? And so the moment where those power dynamics start to shift, then we see the contemporary depiction of what Venezuela looks like in the news media, where Caracas becomes one of the most dangerous, one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in the world, right? And this is largely as a result of a kind of a series of events that have dominoed after the Caracazo. The Caracazo was an event that happened in 1989, where the then president at the time, basically implemented all these structural adjustment programs, so austerity measures, right? Capitalism with steroids, right? They implement all these austerity measures that then, in a very material way, impacted the daily lives of Black and Indigenous people in Venezuela. So like overnight, people saw the doubling, tripling, quadrupling of the cost of bread, the price of milk, of transportation costs, right? And the folks rioted. And so from that moment on, this picture that had been created of Venezuela as this democracy, this ideal democracy that was largely white, that image of Venezuela gets colored, gets blackened by these economic austerity measures that get put into place. And so then we see what kind of sets the stage for what is now the Bolivarian Revolution. And one of the reasons even now the Bolivarian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution continue to be sort of demonized and ostracized by the West is their insistence on using public goods to serve the public, as opposed to concentrating concentrating the benefits of that sort of wealth among a wealthy few, attempting to redistribute it becomes the very issue, right? So then it becomes something that challenges the nature of global capitalism, and that's why global capitalist powers must squash them, right? And so there really is no way, there is nothing in the world that sort of racial capitalism does not touch.
Yeah, and so you mentioned people like rioting after austerity measures and Boulevard Revolution, and so that just reminds me of Black communities and other communities have not taken the dynamics of racial capitalism lying down. A lot of times there has been a lot of resistance with social movements, and there's been movements that have operated from Pan-African, Black feminists, different types of frameworks. And I was just wondering if either of you could talk more about maybe the strengths and weaknesses of social movements in responding to racial capitalism.
I think it is, and I think And that answer, I think, does differ depending on the context, right? I think in the US, we kind of have a unique thing happening where um, activism has become sort of monetized, right? And so this sort of NGOization or non-privatization of certain types of activism where people literally get paid by wealthy benefactors to do certain work, I think I think actually while we know we need resources, right? But a lot of times giving of money is about determining what the agendas are going to be, right? And so I think in the US in particular, and some of the other sort of so-called developed nations, there's a there's an interesting dynamic between what it means to be working against those things, but also simultaneously being funded by them. And I think that that exists to some degree and extent everywhere, but I do think it's more pronounced in the U.S. context. But I think in other places, I mean, so a part of the reason why I started doing research in Venezuela in the first place wasn't because I thought Venezuela was something special in a sort of historical sense. It was a particular moment where people of African descent were saying that there is something that's shifting and there is a possibility of struggle here. Um, in relationship to what the new regime is imagining itself to be, as imperfect as it may be, this feels like a more possible site of struggle, right? And so, I started doing work with the Network of Afro Venezuelans, and they have now in the years. So I first went to Venezuela in 2011 before Chavez died, and in the years since, like in 2019 they formed this international anti-imperialist Afro-descendant Cumbe to fight against basically capitalism and to build sort of a Pan-Africanist global community, right? And so I think that there are these sort of incremental ways that we see these steps being taken, but I also think that's what the African independence era was. That was an attempt, right? I think there are many things that have been undone. Particularly by certain people. I would say the work of Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, even Thomas Sankara a little bit later on, Amilcar Cabral. Like there were a number of people I think working on those things, and I think every time we have seen ourselves pushing to change the quality of our lives, racial capitalism doubles down on it, right? And it figures out how to respond to us in different ways. But I think we are, like you said when you asked the question, we are always in a struggle, always struggling. And even if it's on sort of everyday, what might seem sort of like mundane daily activities to other people, and all the way to the sort of big protests, getting bills passed, and actually literally what's happening in Francophone West Africa right now, like literally schools trying to overthrow right. So there are all these places where I think we're constantly struggling against that.
Yep, and I'm glad that you made the specific point. It's Francophone Africa. It's a very specific colonial relationship. It's not, we see in the news like Africa's exploding with coups, and it's like no, a very particular relationship. It's creating a very specific kind of moment.
Mm-hmm.
So in my work, I think about, yes, like racial capitalism is everywhere. It is omnipresent, but it's not necessarily totalizing. That we are always already making spaces that are like these little kind of niches away from that. And so thinking about some of the cooperative economics, the history of cooperative economics, um, where community land trusts, cooperative housing, cooperative businesses, spaces of mutual aid that do happen and flourish. Something that, when I think about the challenges and the concerns, I think again, it's as Dr. Brown was saying, it's that push to nonprofitize, it's that push to philanthropic capital to come in and give you a strategic plan. As opposed to kind of growing organically from things like the Oakland moms taking over houses. Like, I love that. How do we keep that as a real authentic grassroots movement, to have land back, to claim space in urban centers, for example, or for housing, that and keep resisting, keep pushing back that kind of that control that can come in through the professionalization, and the philanthropic capital that will get us hooked further into
Mm-hmm.
racial capitalism.
Mm. That just reminds me of I was at a gathering a few weeks ago around social ecology and the Black radical tradition, and there was a number of Black elders that have been doing this work for decades. And they mentioned that when the nonprofit industrial complex really was systematized in terms of like tax codes with like Reaganomics in the 80s, all of that, that was the worst thing to ever happen to Black movement building. And one person in particular was waxing poetry about how it was like we would just go to these places, these grocery stores, and tell them, give us money, give us food, or we'll shut you down. Like they did. Like people would say no, and then the whole neighborhood would stop going to that place, and they would go out of business, and then they would have a Black business owner take their place, and things like that. And it's like, these things seem almost unimaginable, being able to do that. And thinking about also, there was this Black cooperative insurance tradition that existed for so long because it was so dangerous to be Black, that none of the insurance companies would insure Black people. Just being a Black person is dangerous, and still is, and so they created all of these Black cooperative institutions, including an insurance provider where, if something happened, folks could get taken care of. And, this provided thousands of jobs, of, middle-class jobs for Black community members. And then when civil rights came around and basically the insurance companies had to start insuring people, now all of those cooperatives go out of business. All of those people are laid off. And this huge economic powerhouse in institution in the Black communities is gone, and I think about how many industries, like every single industry that happened where Black people were taking care of each other and doing things in a more cooperative way. And then, with integration, we see all of that sort of go away. So, I think all that's interesting and sad. And it makes me wonder about like, how do we go back to that? And I think that a big problem is just sort of like Eurocentric dominance. And, you're both in fields that traditionally there was very much of importance on Eurocentric knowledge paradigms, like anthropology, cultural anthropology, urban
traditionally, or now.
And now, but it seems like you both have really managed to incorporate Black ways of knowing, like into your research, into your teaching, despite, this focus on Eurocentric knowledge production in academia. So I was just wondering if you could talk more about how you were able to incorporate more Black ways of knowing into your work, in these established academic frameworks that don't necessarily always allow for that.
Well, let me not go down the rabbit hole of academia as a trip, but I will say that one for myself in a very practical way. So my PhD is in urban planning. I mean, it doesn't kind of get more colonialist. It's regulating property, regulating land. It's grim in here. But but when you are trying to work on talking about Black places, Black spaces, not from a perspective of like, there's a geographic boundary in which there's bodies that look a certain way, and I'm going to like diagnose the pathologies of those bodies. But you're trying to like think about them as places and communities and actual human people. There's kind of nothing but to think about Black ways of knowing, because the stories, the explanations, the descriptions don't exist in a data set you can download. What exists in the data set I can download or in the mainstream knowledge production is, well, how does it feel to be a problem? Like, that's kind of where you're stuck. And we just put your problem in with a boundary around it. So I draw a lot from the work of Black geographies as ways of thinking and knowing. So the idea, and I think about people like Catherine McKittrick and especially Clyde Woods, who talks about this epistemology that if we want to see the places that we are and make them sacred as they are, that we have to be, seeing them, describing them, thinking about how, like, what's specific about them and in a critique of power, a critique of relations that are happening, and that actually comes all the time from like working class people's understanding of what's going on.
Mhm.
I'm here in Portland, Oregon. It's one of our premier urban planning cities, and a lot of times people in planning are like, we just need to explain the stuff to the Black people. We need to explain it better. Black folks in this city understand urban planning not just in a like this is the policy and this is the regulation, but how it actually really works on the ground, how power actually shows up, right? Um, James Baldwin said that one time to Norman Miller. Norman Miller said to him, like, "Oh, I want to get in and see how power really works. I want to understand it in the nitty gritty." And James Baldwin said to him, "Norman, like, I've done that project. I have to know that for my survival. If I did not understand viscerally and intellectually and politically how power works, I would be dead. I would be dead." I know that people know not only what is sacred to us, what is happening in our communities for us, but also how the system is working at us and on us. And that knowledge is what's going to get us to, it's not going to be a different kind of urban planning. Urban planning is going to be urban planning. But I think it will get to a space where we as people, not just Black people, people of color and working class people in general, can figure out how it is that we want to claim and make space and places for ourselves through means other than private property ownership, wealth creation through land, and other kind of colonialist, territorialist kind of nonsense, right? So we're going to develop both our understanding of what's happening and also our pathway out of it. The only way we can do that is through our knowledge making.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo everything Dr. Bay said. I think the only thing I would just add, just as additional context, I think, one of my favorite quotes of Kwame Ture's is that, we are always already aware of the nature of our oppression. And the evidence of that is in how ready we are to riot, right? When something happens, we're always ready. The thing that we often lack is actually sustained organization, right? It's not a lack of awareness of the nature of the issues that we face. It's not even necessarily a lack of creativity about how to respond to them, but it is a lack of sustained organization, right? And so I think I think I know where Dr. Bates was going with I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of academia. I also do not, my PhD is in anthropology, but I very much identify as a Black studies scholar, Pan-African, Black studies, women's studies, and that's just where I was trained. That's all I'll say that. But on the other side of that, I think both in my research, I use autoethnography. And one of the reasons why I do that is because when I went to Venezuela the first time to conduct field research, this is a hostile situation, right? Like the relationship between the U.S. and Venezuela was a hostile one. It still is, right? And so reasonably, when I'm going to conduct interviews, people are going to be like, who are you? Why do you want to do these things? Why is it of interest to you, right? And also, what are you going to do with this information? Which are all legitimate questions, completely legitimate questions. And what I realized about like the way they teach us to conduct ethnographic field work, to make connections with people, is that they're very much foreign to the way we as people engage and how we establish trust. And so what I realized kind of early on, that people had a sense of who I was because of my family's organizing history. And it was that gave me an in to talking to people. It wasn't just because I'm a PhD student, I'm coming here to do research and people would want. In fact, I always tell this story. I went to a community meeting. There was a woman, her name was Luisa Madrid. She was a teacher in the community. And I had already met her prior to this community meeting, but in the meeting, she stood up and she didn't look at me. She didn't say, but she was talking to the room and she said, "We are tired of these academics who come here to do research on us and go back home and write books and make lives and then don't continue to contribute to our communities." Right. And I remember calling my dad that night and being like, "Oh, I don't know if I can do this." I was like, that feels like very much like a warning. He was like, "It was a warning. And you should take it as such," right? And that's not to say that like you can't do it, or they don't even want you to do it, but to hear that this is a, we will not be exploited, we will not be abused, you will not, you don't get to just come in here and extract from us and not give things back, right? And so I also think about that when I think about even my, so I really am kind of into classroom pedagogy and the way um, we learn things too. And one of the things I remember my father used to always tell me when I was a kid, he was like, if you come home and say you're the only person in your class that got an A, it's like, think about what that really means. Because when you grow up, the people in your class, your classmates, are going to be the teachers, the doctors, the community folks all around you. And if you are the only person that is grasping what it is that you're learning in the classroom, what does that mean for your future, right? And so there's no valor in being the only person to do well in a in a classroom assignment, right? To do that on your own. And so like one of the things that I really like, so I went to North Carolina Central University for undergraduate. And one of the things that they were in the Department of History where I was, they were very insistent early on is that we had to learn one another's names because we were in community with each other. And so one of the things that like they would, as a part of your participation grade, you could randomly be asked on any day what a person's name was in the class. And it would not be somebody that sat next to you. And that was because they were trying to make us understand that learning, we are in a community of learning. This is not just your individual assignment to come in and do things, right? But that you have to have a relationship with the people that you learn from and learn with. And so so I try to implement similar things. I also try to move away from like these kind of punitive grading measures. Like, I tell them, like, I don't have all the answers. If I had all the answers, we'd be free. So we're all in here trying to figure it out together. And so I tell them, like, don't come in here asking me questions like I have the answers. We are coming in here to talk about and think about things together, and that you are expected to learn from your classmates just as much as you are expected to learn from me, and vice versa. And I think that also is very much I think the foundation of what Black Studies is. It is very much anti a sort of an institutional or disciplinary way of being that exists in sort of Western academies, right? Even as Black Studies developed, it was about learning from and responding to the experiences of our people beyond the sort of ivory tower, right? And so anytime we are only thinking about what we're doing in the context of the university itself, I think is an affront to what the legacy and what the mission of Black Studies is. And this is a side note, that's one of my beefs with Afro pessimists, because this idea that it is not our job to be prescriptive in some kind of way, and that's not to say, again, that not that we have the answers, but a part of what we're doing is to study our lived experiences in order to understand them, in order to change them. It's not just to study them for the sake of studying them. It is to study them in order to change them. And I think that when that gets lost, the mission of what we're doing gets lost.
Preaching. Well, that just reminds me of the fact that, I'm sure for some students, they're really excited to be in, a more inclusive learning experience. It's valuing diverse knowledge systems. But then there's going to be other students that are very much used to the Ivy Tower kind of banking model of education, of like, I'm pouring my knowledge into you while you sit silently and you accept, my knowledge. And so I was just curious, like, how do you encourage critical engagement with these dominant European paradigms, and really like facilitate dialogue about the importance of embracing alternative ways of knowledge? Because I'm sure that not everyone is immediately on board.
No, not at all.
Yeah. So I think that I am very fortunate in my experience because I teach at a university that has an access mission. And so even though I live in a place that's very predominantly white, and I don't have a classroom that's mostly students of color, although Portland State is becoming a majority student of color institution, will over the next few years. It is working class folks. It is first gen students, immigrant identified students, returning students. And so for many of them, the official story, the Ivory Tower story, already does not track. It doesn't track. So it's not so much trying to engage students in different ideas. They're actually very excited about different ideas. particularly in the last few years, because
Yeah.
they heard racial capitalism somewhere, they heard neoliberalism, they heard abolition. They are hot to try. What is scarier for them is, does this count? Like,
Mhm.
if you're a person who doesn't come from an elite education background, me up in the front being like, I have a PhD and I'm great. Yeah, cool. You're a professor. Like, you could think about whatever you want. You could talk in fancy and highfalutin words whenever you want. But I'm just a regular person and I got to go into my regular life. Um, is this going to count? So it's more about trying to give people the confidence that,
Mhm.
yeah, actually the stuff you already know is real. I teach a lot of theory classes, and I'm constantly just trying to affirm to the students, like, you're already theorizing. Your homie is theorizing, your aunties are theorizing, right? When you leave this classroom, if you can't take the stuff that we're talking about in this classroom and like spit that down at the barbershop,
Mhm.
I'm failing,
Mhm.
because this is stuff that comes from people. And anyone can do this. And in fact, I would love it if for you to take these materials into the other parts of your life and come back with what folks are telling you, right? Please, like, I'll press print for you. Don't even use your print credits. uh,
Mhm.
so I think that really, I'm very fortunate in that way, because the pushback is more of like, is this credential gonna matter to me, gonna can it count to other people if I spend my time like learning about me.
Yeah.
um
Mm.
and so but we have a lot of conversation about, one of my favorite pieces about what is the point of Black studies is a piece by June Jordan
Mhm.
called Bringing Back the Person.
Mhm.
And she talks about the, sort of the uprising of Black students in the university to demand Black studies, to demand ethnic studies. And she for me, like, she sets out a different teaching goal, which is not so much about like of substance or like academic accretion of the bank, the bank of knowledge. She says, life appealing to live and to be and to know a community that will protect the living simply because we are alive.
Mm.
This is the menace to the university curriculum and standards. This is the possibility of survival.
Mm. That's so deep. That is
She's a
so
poet, so she says it poetic. So
mm.
Yeah, and you know what's it's also ironic because we also know that universities are literally so what we do is subversive in the context, right? They literally exist to maintain the status quo. They exist to create, to create and maintain class distinctions, right, between people, which is why university education is not accessible and free to all, because it's yet another one of those barriers or hurdles that folks have to cross in order to create certain types of division in society. So I think even literally just trying to, I mean, so I'm at a different type of university. When I was at UMass Boston, which I think was more like Portland State, I had a very different experience in the classroom, right? And I enjoyed it a lot more because I actually did have predominantly students of color. I would have like I can remember one semester I think I had like 13 African countries represented in my class and like three like just a very different dynamic. But now I'm at Northeastern and that it is it requires a different way of engaging in the classroom. But I will say that one of the things that I have increasingly moved to in my evaluation methods is I don't grade. So I've moved to labor contracts. And what the labor contracts basically tell my students is that you are coming in here to get information. And my primary goal is for you to be able to employ what you learn here for the sake of doing something out in the world, right? And so in a lot of ways that means I let students be really creative. Like I don't with final projects, I don't tell people my students what they have to do with it, right? So I ask them to give me a final project that shows me what you've learned in this class and how you are going to use that out in the world, right? And that can be, and so for students who are creative and artistic, that can be some kind of creative and artistic expression. Like one of the projects that I thought was the coolest that one of my students did, he was a video game major, and he basically created a gaming major, and he basically created a virtual art museum where he had exhibits of all the Black video game characters that ever existed, and you could literally like walk through. And he was thinking about like this sort of imaging, controlling images and stereotypes of Black folks that exist in video game players, right? And so, like, there's no way I could have assigned that as a project. I wouldn't have said, create this thing, right? But because that was something that he was already doing, that was his way of showing me what he had learned in class and how it would be useful beyond the scope of our classroom. But I think that, like, even just trying to make my students understand that I am not interested in you regurgitating answers to me. I am actually interested in you thinking about what these things mean to you. But that also means that we have to be able to have hard conversations. And that as much as I tell my students of color this all the time, you can always opt out. Like, you do not have to choose to educate people about who you are and your existence on a daily basis. But as a teacher in this particular setting, it is my responsibility to do that. And so, like, and I might opt out of that outside of the classroom, but in the classroom, that's my responsibility. And so that we have to have hard conversations. And so that means that some of the problematic things that some of my students might believe actually need to be said aloud so that they can be countered, right? And so that's one of the things that I always tell my students. I am very uninterested in the sterile right answers to everything and the knowing what you should say when it doesn't actually mean anything to you. I'm much more interested in a conversation that actually pushes your thinking. And in order to do that, you have to be honest about where you are to begin with. And I think what makes that possible is my own modeling of that, right? So in the same way that I use autoethnography, I just tell a lot of stories about how I came to know and understand certain things. And I think the more that folks who learn from us understand that we are also in a process of learning, and that we did not always exist as we exist right now in the way we understand things, and that there are things that shifted our perspectives and ideas about things. I think when we model and demonstrate that for folks, then people are more open to thinking about where their own thinking may go. And then too, I think probably, I don't know, Dr. Bates, you're in urban planning, so you may have a different, but for me, usually when I teach, like I teach a Black social movement class. I teach, gender, social justice, transnational activism. So for the most part, the what you come in to study is in the title of my class. And so a lot of the students, what you're getting into. And so there is a level and degree of self-selection. But I do occasionally get initially, I think, hesitant or slightly, disagreeable students. But I typically have primarily good experiences after, the first couple of weeks, and I get people to open up.
Yeah. I have nothing but blessings for the people whose like personal journey on their heart is bringing these ideas to the genuinely clueless to hostile.
Mm-hmm.
The folks who are teaching required ethnic studies classes that are general education requirements in the university, with a lot of people who don't want to be there.
Yes.
It's not my journey, but I think that what is powerful in that space, I mean, the reason that people want to shut down Black studies, the reason that people want to shut down ethnic studies, it's not about like white kids are going to feel bad or sad about themselves. It's the fear that people will develop a solidarity, that they will develop a lens, that they will start knowing and saying and see racial capitalism, oppression, power hierarchy. They will start to see that. They will see how it's manifesting in their own lives, how it's making them sick, how it's curtailing their own capacity for human interface and love. That's the danger of these types of classes. That's why people want to shut them down, because they know, I think we've always known since the beginning of Black studies in the university, but also Black studies outside of the university and freedom schools, is that it's a political education. It's going to make you want to change something. It's going to make you change yourself. And there's people who are very invested in that never happening. And so that's why we have to keep doing it. we have to persist and resist and do the things that, again, have always already existed. And we got to keep pushing them.
Yeah.
That just reminds me. So I actually went to Florida State. I graduated 15 years ago, very long time. But at the time, ethnic studies were required, were a gen ed thing. And of course, now that's not the case in Florida and any school in Florida anymore. But I remember that class, the first ethnic studies class I took, because I was a philosophy major. And most of my classes, I was sitting and listening to libertarians, act out debate class or whatever, and reading about Plato and all these people that I wasn't that interested in, but I was like, they tell me that these are the smart people I need to know to understand life. And, this one teacher kind of just blew everything open. And my whole trajectory around what I was studying and what my life was in general changed at that point. And this was a Latino teacher. And even though we didn't necessarily share the same cultural background, her storytelling about her life and integrated with the readings that included a lot of readings from the Black radical tradition, it really allowed me to think about like what kind of world that I wanted to be a part of. And that was not the world that I was currently in or the world that I'm currently in today, but we're working towards that, right? And so with that in mind, I was just wondering, as our last kind of wrap up question, thinking about Black storytelling and Black cultural heritage, Black cultural artifacts, like how can these contribute to like forward thinking actions and help us like really reimagine like what is possible? Another big question.
I mean, they have to. They just have to, because we have to do that, right? I don't know. I used to be like a real, hardcore sort of pragmatic, like you organize, you set a goal, you win the thing, you go to the campaign. And I've become much more interested in, a visionary futurism. My colleague Walida Imarisha talks about this a lot in terms of, casting out our fictional worlds. Obviously, Adrienne Maree Brown, their work together on Octavia's Brood, Alexis Pauline Gumbs, and other folks who are talking about these dreams, and of course Robin Kelley, Freedom Dreams. It just has to be, because we need the stories to point us to where we need to be. We need the stories to point us to where we need to be. And if we're going to act on the scale and the scope at which is necessary to make these kinds of changes, we have to keep telling ourselves these stories. Yeah, and we just need them.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the I guess like a parallel to this that I always talk about in class when because I know I can have, because I'm also kind of pragmatic, I can be very pessimistic about things sometimes. And one of the struggles that I have as a teacher is to both offer my students truth, but also not pass my pessimism on to them, right? and that's really hard to do sometimes, because students are always like, so what do we do? What do we do? And I'm like, I don't have the answers, but hopefully we keep trying to figure those things out. But I do also think that what I tell them is that, think about our enslaved ancestors who for generations were locked on a plantation, children taken away from them, beaten, and in their minds they still believe that one day they would be free. Right. And so like that, I think to me is like to think about a person's existence who over generations has not known freedom and knows that even their child, as before they come into the world, will not know freedom, was still dreaming about that. Right. And so I think that there is something, I'm I'm also like I'm really into, so that's actually, it's funny because I think there's so many things to take from Octavia Butler's works. But what I realized that I like a lot about Parable of the Sower is that I really like apocalyptic genres of TV, of books, whatever. And a part of the reason why I like apocalyptic genres is because what they most of the time are a meditation on what we will return to when society devolves from all of the other things that give us distractions or whatever, and how will we then exist. And I think that that's also what Octavia was playing with in the Parables trilogy, which we only got 2 books out of because of her tragic death. But I think there is something to thinking about. Okay, so when this, because that's the other thing. the apocalypse. I think, because of like biblical ideas about the apocalypse, we think about it as the end of the world. But the important thing about the apocalypse is that it's the end of the world as we know it.
Mm.
And so knowing that this world may no
Mm.
longer exist doesn't necessarily mean the world no longer exists. And that there is something that all of this shit could actually blow up and we could still figure out how to live, right? And I think that is a useful place to start, to say that just because these things that we've become accustomed to get destroyed, whether they be the good or the bad, doesn't mean that something else won't bloom out of that that's better, right? And so I think that visioning means that we also can be afraid of destruction, and a lot of this stuff got to be destroyed. And so I think that's really, I think that's one of the limitations to the way we think about the future, is because we want to keep so many things intact as they already are, and we would just want to change the bad things. But it might just be the case that everything must go. And we have to, and we have to do it all over again. And I think that people who have the capacity to think about what that might look like are vital and crucial to our ability to imagine an otherwise existing world that we don't live in at the moment.
Mm. That just reminds me of a quote that I've heard. I don't know what the exact quote is, and I don't know who said it, but this person mentioned that, for our African ancestors, the apocalypse happened 10 times over. The apocalypse happens when they were forced on a ship and, forced to participate in the Maafa. And when they landed and were put to work, that was another apocalypse, when their children were stripped from them. And so thinking about the worst case scenario happened over and over and over, but we're still here. And I think that there's something profound about that, where people that constantly had like what we can't even imagine, the kind of harms that they experienced, and they still created families, they still retained their culture, they still dreamed of a better world. And so I think as we're struggling with the way that the world is going right now, before we went live, we were just talking about the heat wave that's happening in Portland right now. It's really scary, and a lot of things that's happening all over the country, but keeping in mind that there's always something to fight for, there's always something to dream. And so with that, I was curious if anyone had any announcements. I know that Dr. Brown, you have a podcast.
Yes. So this is Dr. Sharice Burdenselli and I. This is our second iteration of a podcast. This one is Life Study Revolution, which I think it really speaks to kind of, I think, how I learn and exist. And so it's really sort of about our own attempting to navigate life, to study, and to think about what revolution will be, right? And so we would do that through our own personal stories, but also to have other people in. We've had one live and one kind of preliminary episode, but we are in the process of getting ready for an actual season premiere. So just stay tuned. You can find us on all of the social media. Well, not all of them, because we're not on TikTok. We're not exploding. But it's on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. If you just look up Life Study Revolution, that is there.
If I could say, I just went to the YouTube page, and the first video that's there, the screen capture is gorgeous. It's just two gorgeous people, Black people, laughing. I mean, just looking amazing. So I can't wait. I can't wait to listen to this.
It's nice to do work with your friends who share your values. I would say that.
Yeah, well, before we wrap up real quick, Freedom to Thrive is having a little barbecue situation this weekend. Hopefully it'll be a little bit cooler. And we're also having next week a webinar. I'll be posting more about that on our social media. Folks want to follow us on Freedom to Thrive on Instagram and on Twitter. I guess we're technically on TikTok, but I'm not posting on there like that because I don't use TikTok like that, but maybe one day we will. But just wanted to thank you both for being here and having this amazing conversation and just, sharing your wisdom with us. I really appreciate it. I've learned so much and I appreciate you both.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. And to meet you, Dr. Bates. I know we don't know each other personally, but I'm happy to have been in conversation.
I'm glad we know each other now.
Yes, yes.
Great.
Thank you. Bye.